Hey there, learners. Back for another deep dive. Awesome. Always love having those of you who really want to dig into something, find those aha moments without getting totally overwhelmed. You're in the right place. Today's going to be a bit of a bridge between, well, I wouldn't say totally opposite worlds, but maybe not something you'd automatically connect.
Yeah.
Chinese philosophy and Chinese medicine.
You hit it right on the head there with that bridge idea. Because, it's fascinating that even someone like Zhang Shichun, who was super influential in how Chinese medicine developed, even he felt the need to argue that philosophy wasn't just some side thing, but like the core foundation of medicine. Makes you wonder, why did he even need to say that?
Exactly. Like, was there a pushback against philosophy or something?
That's what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. Really explore how these two, philosophy and medicine, have been so intertwined throughout history, not just sharing ideas, but even like the social scenes they were part of. So by the end, you'll have a much richer, deeper view of both. And our map for this terrain, primarily the Chinese philosophy and Chinese medicine entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Super solid research there.
Perfect. So before we get too far, let's be clear on what we even mean by Chinese medicine. I'm guessing it's not just the acupuncture or herbs we might picture at first.
You got it. The source is specific. We're talking traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM. Got to distinguish that from Western biomedicine, which is a whole other thing, and even from other medical systems within China itself, like Tibetan or Korean traditions. Plus, TCM is way more than just treating when you're sick. It's about prevention to like Tai Chi Quan, stuff like that, and even techniques for living longer. It's this big picture view of well-being, not just fix it when broken.
So more about cultivating health, not just interventions. The article mentions medicine being a qualitative science in Chinese history. That phrasing alone probably has our philosopher listeners' ears perked up.
It's important because it shows how medicine, or yi, wasn't this isolated thing. It was grouped with other qualitative sciences, and a key one was Yangsheng, nurturing life. Think all those self-cultivation practices, and later on, you even get Bencao Materia Medica, the study of medicinal substances and alchemy thrown in there, both the internal and external sorts. The takeaway is Chinese thought didn't chop up knowledge like we do now, and science wasn't this one unified thing either.
So, different areas of expertise, but related. Where does philosophy itself fit in that? Was it totally off doing its own thing?
At first, yeah. Early Chinese sciences, medicine included, were seen as these technical specialties, distinct from those big, general philosophical works, the master's texts. You see this in the Han Shu, how it categorizes stuff. Philosophy's over there with the 6 classics and masters, while medicine and longevity practices are in recipes and methods, Fangji. That Fangji category had all the medical classics, those classical recipes, even the sexual arts and those practices for immortality. This is really where the Feng Shi come in the recipe masters, those practitioners of medicine and divination hanging around the Han court.
So philosophy with its big ideas and then these technical folks like doctors and alchemists doing their own thing seems pretty separate. But I feel like there's got to be a connection we're about to uncover around.
You bet. Even though the categories were there and how they organized texts, the very beginnings of what we think of as science in China, it was this really interesting mix of ideas from both philosophers and those technical experts, those early physicians included. The article makes it clear the Fang Shi and their concerns, their expertise, wasn't totally disconnected from early philosophy. Trying to totally separate out their philosophical, religious, and technical stuff is almost artificial, they say. So both disciplines kind of sprouted from similar intellectual ground.
Interesting. So categorized differently later on, but early on there's a lot of back and forth, and I'm guessing that shared ground had some pretty big ideas about reality, the human being, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. It all comes down to these core concepts they both used. Qi, sometimes called vital energy or life force, yin-yang, the whole complementary opposites thing, and wuxing, those 5 agents or 5 phases representing dynamic elemental forces. These weren't just medical terms, they were foundational for early Chinese thinkers, philosophers too, on how they understood the cosmos and everything in it. Philosophers were using these ideas everywhere. Cosmology of the I Ching, the Book of Changes, bigger theories of correlative cosmology, the idea that heaven, earth, and humans are all linked, reflecting a shared cosmic order. They even use these concepts to define what a classic text was in their tradition.
And Chinese medicine, particularly its early forms, it seems like it just adopted these same core concepts wholesale.
Absolutely. The Huangdi Nejing, the Yellow Emperor's classic of internal medicine, like the foundational text for Chinese medicine, it's packed with these concepts. Specifically, it presents the human body as a microcosm, a tiny version of the cosmos running on the same principles of yin yang and the five agents. This wasn't just borrowing words, it was putting the whole understanding of the body within this cosmic framework. Health becomes about keeping that cosmic harmony inside yourself. So, same fundamental language for both the big universe and the individual human experience within it.
Makes sense. If you're a philosopher trying to figure out health on a deeper level, grounding it in a cosmic order, that's a powerful framework.
Let's get into the philosophical roots a bit more. The article highlights the Zhuangzi and how it talks about qi. What's really cool in the Zhuangzi is how clearly it identifies qi as like the basis of our physical existence. It straight up says human birth is caused by the gathering together of qi. Then it emphasizes harmonizing the six qi. These are like those environmental energies: wind, cold, heat, dampness, dryness, and fire that can really mess with our balance. The Zhuangzi even says it wants to harmonize the essences of the six qi in order to nurture life. So this early philosophy text is already linking qi to health and well-being, which is super interesting.
So even in a text mostly about, the nature of reality, living a good life, those big philosophy questions, it's already applying these ideas to the human body in a way that kind of hints at later medical theories. What about other philosophical schools? They mentioned the Lushi Chunki too.
The Lushi Chinqui, or the Springs and Autumns of Master Lu, it gives this interesting take. It talks about sages, those super wise figures, reaching that elevated status through both metaphysical understanding and physical practice. Like, they're making their jinshin, their essence and spirit tranquil, but they're also actively doing stuff to preserve and extend their lives. This directly links to the rise of nurturing life techniques, yang sheng, which is a huge area where philosophical ideas and those practical medical concerns really come together, as we'll see.
Sounds like these early philosophers weren't just thinking in the abstract. They were trying to figure out how to live long, healthy lives, laying the groundwork for all those health-focused practices. But then the article brings up Zuyan and a more like technical systemization of yin-yang and wuxing.
Yeah.
Where does he fit into all this philosophy stuff?
Zuyan, he's a fascinating guy, kind of mysterious too. He's given credit for taking yin-yang and wuxing, those core ideas, and turning them into a more, systematic, maybe even rigid framework. The cool part is, the Shiji, the Records of the Grand Historian, it calls him a member of the Jixia Academy, which was like the philosophy hub back in the Warring States period. But then the Hanshu, the history of the former Han Dynasty, it labels him as a fangshi, a recipe master. That fuzziness about what category he belongs to, that tells you a lot about how blurry the lines were between philosophy and those technical practices like medicine and divination back then. The fangshi, they were these practitioners who often claimed secret knowledge, special formulas, and they used yin-yang and wuxing cosmology like crazy in their arts. So Zuyan, being in both those worlds, intellectual and practical, shows how deeply connected those seemingly separate spheres were through these cosmological ideas.
And this cosmology, it didn't just stay abstract, did it? The article talks about how they developed these analogies between the human body, the political state, and the cosmos. Our philosopher friends would be all over that kind of systems thinking.
Oh, absolutely. This correlative cosmology, it's key to understanding the whole philosophy-medicine link. Over time, the way the Chinese understood the natural world, it started to reflect, even mirror, their political organization. Body, state, cosmos, all interconnected systems running on the same principles, coming from how they applied yin-yang and wuxing. These ideas were big in political philosophy, how to govern, social order, all that. But they also totally shaped how early medicine understood the human body and how it worked.
I got to ask, can you give us a concrete example of this body-state-cosmos analogy playing out in early medical thought? It sounds like a pretty big deal for how they saw the human being fitting into the bigger picture.
The Huangdi Jing has some awesomely vivid examples. It describes this direct link, like an analogy, between how the body is put together and the cosmos. One line says, heaven is round, earth is square, people's heads are round, their feet are square, and thereby correspond to them, and it goes on and on. 2 eyes matching the sun and moon, the 9 orifices matching the 9 regions of earth, joy and anger like wind and rain, limbs aligning with the 4 seasons, you name it. They even saw the 360 joints of the body as corresponding to the 365 days of the year. This shows how much philosophical cosmology shaped their view of the body and its health. For a philosopher, this kind of systematic analogical thinking would be right up their alley.
That is a pretty comprehensive image. The human body as a mini-universe shows how interconnected their whole worldview was in both philosophy and early medicine. Now, let's get to nurturing life, Yang Sheng. Seems like the spot where wanting a long, good life met practical ways to get there.
Totally. Yang Sheng was the big pursuit. where wanting a long, fulfilling life, that philosophical idea, ran right into methods for staying healthy. The goal was to preserve your person, your essential nature, by being proactive about health and well-being. And the cool thing, the very term Yangsheng, it first pops up in a philosophical text, the Zhuangzi.
And the Zhuangzi even has a whole chapter on it, right? The Lord of Nurturing Life. What does that tell us about how philosophers were thinking about Yangsheng back then?
Yeah, that chapter uses the story about a butcher named Pao Ding, and it becomes this amazing analogy for mastering a skill, but it's presented as a direct instruction on Yangsheng, which is fascinating. Pao Ding, he explains how at first he saw the ox as a whole, then as parts, but eventually with practice he could just perceive the ox intuitively moving his knife effortlessly along its natural structure. Duke Wei of Liang sees this and is amazed, and Pao Ding tells him it's not about hacking, but about following the natural order. And get this, the Duke says, Pao Ding has taught me how to nurture life. The point here for philosophy is that understanding and working with the natural structure of things, whether it's an ox or your own being, that's how you live in harmony and stay healthy. It's about knowing that natural order.
Beautiful analogy. Effortless mastery through deep understanding. So Yangsheng wasn't just doing certain exercises, but a way of being, a kind of awareness. But then the Zhuangzi seems to critique some approaches to longevity, the ones just focused on external practices.
You're catching the nuances here. The Zhuangzi often contrasts that ideal of the realized person, the sage, who lives in tune with the Tao, with those obsessed with techniques like guide and pull, Tao Yin exercises, and nourishing the body, Yang Xing. They're after extreme longevity like Pengzu, that legendary figure. The Zhuangzi is saying true sagehood, a truly good life, it comes from a deeper inner cultivation, not just those specific, sometimes kind of forced physical practices. It's about your inner being flowing with life, not obsessing over living forever through artificial means.
So the Zhuangzi is more internal, maybe even spiritual or philosophical about Yangsheng. But they also mention the Guanzi, another text, and that one seems more about concretely cultivating Qi, Jing, and Shen. How did these different philosophical takes on Yangsheng relate to how medical practices developed later on?
The inner cultivation, Neye chapter of the Guanzi, it goes deep into those more practical aspects of self-cultivation. It's all about nurturing your Qi vital energy, Jing bodily fluids and essence, and Shen spirit or consciousness. It even describes the Tao, poetically, as flowing through the sage's body because of those cultivated energies. And the Zhuangzi itself, even with its critiques, it introduces the idea of the Shenren, the spirit person, who's transformed their Qi and spirit so much that they can even impact the world around them. These explorations of the body's energy and spirit, from a philosophical point of view, they were crucial for those more systematized practices that later show up in medicine.
It's interesting that while these philosophy texts talk about the principles and goals of Yangsheng, the Zhuangzi doesn't include doctors when it lists those skilled craftspeople who've mastered the way. Any thoughts on why that might be, especially from a philosophical perspective?
That's a sharp observation. It might suggest that how the Zhuangzi sees self-cultivation, it's very personal, maybe even solitary, not something you need a doctor for. It fits with how the text emphasizes internal change, acting spontaneously, understanding the natural order within yourself, not relying on some expert outside you. It might even hint at an early distinction, maybe even a tension, between philosophy's approach to well-being and medicine as a profession starting to develop.
That's a fascinating interpretation. Early on, maybe philosophy was leaning towards self-reliance when it came to well-being. So how did these Yangsheng ideas become more, concrete, systematized medical practices? The article mentions the Fengshi, the Han Dynasty, being important here.
During the Han Dynasty, Yangsheng became like the main focus for those Fengshi, the recipe masters. They took those philosophical ideas about nurturing life and made them into specific, often ritualized techniques for living longer and being super healthy. Think the breathing exercises, meditation, special diets, herbal and mineral drugs, even really intricate sexual techniques. It was all about absorbing, moving, and transforming Qi in the body.
And we have some pretty amazing archaeological evidence for those early Yangsheng practices, right?
Yeah.
Those texts from the Mawangdui tomb.
Oh, yeah. The stuff dug up from the Mawangdui tombs going back to 169 BCE gives us incredible firsthand looks at those longevity techniques from before and during the Han Dynasty. Along with the famous Silk Dao De Jing manuscripts, they found other medical writings specifically on Yangsheng, texts like Harmonizing Yin and Yang and Discussion of the Realized Way of All Under Heaven. They go into detail about all these sexual cultivation techniques, even using animal metaphors for different moves and positions.
Animal metaphors for sex positions. Now, that's a vivid image. Can you give us an example of what those descriptions were like?
For sure. In harmonizing yin and yang, you find 10 postures described with names like tiger roving, cicada clinging, river deer butting, dragonfly skimming the water. The idea is that sex, while natural, you got to do it mindfully with control for your health and to live longer. The realized way of all under heaven puts it nicely. What assists life is eating, what injures life is lust. Therefore, the sage, when conjoining male and female, invariably possesses a model. It's philosophy's ideas of balance and moderation put into practice, literally.
Pretty pragmatic approach, combining those philosophical ideals with real physical practices. Were there other Yang Sheng things documented at Moangdui besides those sexual techniques?
Definitely. They also found recipes for nurturing life, listing specific foods, drugs, and drinks good for you, with instructions on how to make and take them, sometimes even combined with sexual exercises. Eliminating Grain and Eating Vapor was this fascinating text about special diets and breathing, kind of esoteric, for nourishing the body differently. Then, 10 questions, it had dialogues and statements about various Yang Sheng techniques. There's this great part where Yao and Shen, those legendary figures, talk about how important it is to understand yin and yang for cultivating life. And maybe the coolest find visually was the drawings of guiding and pulling, or Dao Yin Tu, showing 44 figures and poses doing what looks like therapeutic exercises. These are described more in the pulling book, or Yunishu, found at Zhengjiashan. It lists exercises named after animals like inchworms, snakes, tigers. It's a clear example of how the Daoyin tradition was developing, which later led to all sorts of therapeutic exercise in China.
Wow. So Han Dynasty Yang Sheng culture, it was all about being active with your body and mind, trying to control how you felt, physically and mentally, through all these Kwai-related practices. And it was a type of self-cultivation, but in this big, holistic way. Not just health and longevity, but even moral stuff and spiritual refinement.
Exactly. The scholar Mark Csikszentmihalyi calls this an embodied virtue tradition. These practices were thought to directly change your kai, shaping both body and mind. These material virtue traditions, they had a huge impact on early Taoist philosophy and medical theory, but also on early Chinese ethics and metaphysics more broadly.
We're seeing a deep, evolving link between how they thought about life, well-being, all that philosophical stuff, and those practical techniques, often very detailed, for actually achieving those things. Now, the article moves on to more explicitly Taoist connections to medicine, talking about Gerhong, Tao Hongjing, and Sun Simiao. They seem to represent this intertwining of philosophy and medicine becoming even stronger.
Absolutely. Those three, they mark a big chapter where specific Taoist beliefs and practices get really woven into medical knowledge and how they did medicine. Gehong, from the Eastern Jin dynasty, he might be the first outright Taoist physician who wrote a lot about alchemy, which he saw as tied to immortality and therefore health. His major work, The Teachings of the Master Who Embraces Simplicity, the Bao Puzi, it's even split into inner chapters about Taoist immortality stuff and outer chapters for more worldly matters.
And Gehong himself, he had a pretty interesting background, combining that classical Confucian learning with a personal search for Taoist immortality.
For sure. He was educated in the Confucian classics, but he also got really into those Taoist techniques for nourishing your body and spirit to achieve immortality. He studied under the alchemist Zheng Yin for years, and then really committed to those immortality practices after a short stint in the military. He wrote about all sorts of Taoist techniques. Shuyi preserving unity, Xingqi circulating energy, Daoyin exercises, and Fangzong Shu those sexual practices for longevity. But importantly, he stressed that moral self-cultivation was essential, like those key Confucian virtues: Ren benevolence, Sin trustworthiness, Zong loyalty, and Xiao filial piety. You gotta have those if you're serious about immortality, he said. He was critical of Taoists who just talked philosophy without putting it into practice. You need both ethical behavior and real Taoist study, he said. He also went deep into inner and outer alchemy, Jindan and Huangbai, and using medicinal herbs, Shan Yao. Interestingly, some pharmacology books attributed to him might even be the first time smallpox is mentioned in Chinese writing.
So Gehong, a total polymath, blending Confucian ethics, Taoist practices, alchemy, and practical medicine. Then there's Tao Hongjing, who founded Shenking Taoism. What did he contribute to this whole philosophy-medicine intersection?
Tao Hongjing, he lived during the Southern Dynasty, is another big figure. He had court jobs at first, but then famously retired to Mount Mao to study and practice those new Shenking Taoist revelations. He is the one who compiled the Declarations of the Perfected, the Zhengao, super important for the Shenking school. And what's key for us, Tao Hongjing's family knew a lot about making and using medicines, and he was really interested in both that stuff, the materia medica, and medical theory itself. He did something huge for pharmacology with his collected commentaries to the canonical pharmacopoeia, the Benkao Jingjizu. It was a massive commentary and expansion on the Shen Nong Benkao, that earlier foundational text about medicinal herbs. So like Geihong, Taohong Jing shows that overlap of philosophy, Taoist practice, medicine, pharmacology, even alchemy, all happening at the same time in one person.
They weren't just dabbling in both, they were deep in it, shaping both fields with their understanding. And then there's Sun Simiao, the medicine Buddha, king of medicine. His legacy feels huge.
Sun Simiao from the Sui and Tang dynasties. Yeah, he's maybe the most revered philosopher-physician in Chinese medicine, not just for his knowledge, but also for his medical ethics. The story goes he got interested in medicine as a kid because he was sick a lot. He practiced medicine near the Tang capital, traveled extensively, then lived a secluded life studying on Mount Wubai, now called Yao Wangshan, or Medicine King Mountain. And this is important. Sun Simiao was a scholar of those philosophical classics, the Yi Jing, Dao Jing, Yin Yang theory, and divination and numerology, Shushu. He applied yin yang and wuxing and those microcosm, macrocosm ideas we talked about throughout his medical work. He's actually the first Chinese physician who wrote a lot in a systematic way about medical ethics, emphasized compassion, treating all patients equally no matter their social status or wealth. His two big works, Prescriptions Worth 1,000 Gold, Qin Jin Fang, and the supplement, Qin Jin Yifang, they're gigantic, covering pretty much all of medical practice back then. Thousands of herbal remedies, history of medicine, diet, yang sheng practices, pulse diagnosis, acupuncture and moxibustion, massage, exercises, even sections just on gynecology and pediatrics. He was big on identifying and preparing herbs correctly, and even included folk remedies and stuff from other countries. He also wrote about Taoist alchemy and had an important essay called Preserving and Nourishing Life, Shang Lun. So Sun Simiao is the perfect blend of Taoist philosophy, medical knowledge, expertise in plants, and alchemy, all shaped by those core philosophical ideas and texts.
Clearly, from those three guys, Geihong, Taohong Jing, Sun Simiao, Taoist philosophy and medicine weren't just borrowing from each other a little, it was total integration. Now, back to Zhang Xichu, the guy we mentioned at the start. He's crucial because he talked about this connection directly when China was going through a lot of intellectual and medical changes.
Zhang Xichun lived during a crazy time. Traditional knowledge systems were meeting Western science and medicine. He saw those debates happening about whether Chinese thought, including philosophy and medicine, were still relevant compared to those new foreign ideas. His essay concerning the relation of philosophy and medicine tackles this head-on. Some folks were saying that Chinese philosophy was holding back medical progress, and Zhang totally disagreed. He argued that philosophy is actually the basis and guiding principle of medicine, not a hindrance.
And he goes back to classic Chinese thought to support this, right?
Right.
Using that historical connection we've been exploring.
Yep. He quotes from the Book of Songs, one of the oldest Chinese poetry collections, talking about being intelligent and wise and protecting his own person. He links that ancient wisdom to the traditional Tao of nurturing life, Yang Sheng Ji Dao, which he says is basically philosophy. His point is, those who truly got Yang Sheng and were naturally benevolent, they'd want to help others. He says when Yang Sheng alone wasn't enough to stop suffering, these wise people used their philosophical understanding to come up with principles and created medicine and pharmacology to help those who couldn't nurture their own lives effectively. He even names Gehong, Taohong Jing, and Sun Simiao as examples of those philosopher-physicians seamlessly blending both.
But it seems his interpretation of the Huangduni Jing's opening chapter is the core of his argument, connecting the very start of Chinese medical thinking to a philosophical view of being human.
You got it. Zhang Xichun focuses on that famous description of the true men, Zhenren, from way back in time in the first chapter of the Huangduni Jing. According to the text, those folks lived super long, healthy lives because they deeply understood and practiced yin-yang, cultivating and transforming their qi and guarding their spirit. Zhang says that the Neijing, by starting with this ideal human state achieved through philosophy and self-cultivation, shows that philosophy is where you got to start if you want to understand health and illness. You got to understand and protect your own being through philosophy and working with your own qi before you can help others heal. He ends with a powerful line. From this, we understand that philosophy is the true source of medicine, or rather that medicine is the natural outcome of philosophy. This is why the Neijing states explicitly that the study of medicine must start from philosophy. Then he challenges those who say philosophy blocks medicine, pointing out that the core medical text says the opposite.
A very compelling argument, grounded in history, especially coming from someone involved in reforming and modernizing Chinese medicine at a time when East and West were meeting. It brings us full circle to his idea that philosophy isn't blocking medical progress, but is the foundation. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways about this connection between Chinese philosophy and medicine, especially for someone coming at it from a philosophical angle?
It's clear that this connection is deep and multi-layered, running through the heart of both traditions. They share those basic ideas about reality and cosmology, like qi, yin-yang, and wuxing, and they both historically used complex analogies like that microcosm, macrocosm stuff. They might have been categorized separately sometimes in their texts, but their origins and how they developed were super intertwined, especially in the Yangsheng tradition. Giz Heng, Tao Hongjing, and Sun Simiao, those Taoist physicians, they're great examples of how closely philosophy and medicine were woven together. And then Zhang Xun, in a more modern context, he argues that philosophy is where Chinese medicine comes from, emphasizing self-knowledge and self-cultivation as the basis for understanding health and healing. For a philosopher, this whole history is a fascinating case study in how big ideas about reality, what it means to be human, and living a good life can shape a complex and long-lasting system of medicine.
So, for you listening, especially if philosophy is your thing, you can see now that Chinese medicine is deeply rooted in Chinese philosophical thought. It's this compelling story of shared ideas, interconnected practices, and people who saw these two areas not as separate, but as totally linked parts of understanding ourselves and our place in the cosmos.
This leads to a big question for you to think about. Even today, with our focus on modern science, could understanding the history and philosophy of Chinese medicine change how you see health and well-being? Does it maybe suggest different ways, even ways that work alongside modern approaches, to think about how we, our bodies, minds, and the world around us are all connected?
That's an awesome point to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Chinese philosophy and Chinese medicine. Hope you found some unexpected insights and something to really ponder. Keep learning, keep diving deep, and we'll catch you on the next exploration.